The message that reached me through the Institute's intake terminal was addressed to someone named Harvin Salas. Audit observer, cleared for passive observation of the perpetual trial. No interaction, no participation, observation only. I am not Harvin Salas. Harvin Salas, according to the proctor administrator who met me at the sealed corridor, had filed a withdrawal form 14 minutes before my shuttle docked, and the Institute's intake protocol, which had been running without modification for 218 years, did not have a withdrawal and replacement procedure. It had a withdrawal procedure and a replacement procedure, and those were separate forms, and no one had ever needed to run them simultaneously. So the system had done what systems do when they have two inputs and no combined pathway. It had matched them. I was now the active trial candidate. The proctor administrator was a Vaethorun, tall, bilaterally symmetric in a way that felt slightly wrong, pale, green filaments running under the skin of his forearms that pulsed faintly when he was agitated. They were pulsing now. He explained the situation with the careful precision of a being who was deeply embarrassed but professionally prohibited from showing it. He explained that the perpetual trial was the Institute's central assessment instrument, that it had been in continuous operation for 2 centuries, that it was designed to run until the candidate either produced a valid answer token or collapsed the attempt, and that the median completion time across all species and all cohorts was 31 days. He said 31 days the way you say a number you expect to land. I asked him what happened to my luggage. The filaments went very bright. He showed me to the threshold. The door was a vertical plane of faintly luminescent material, opaque, with no handle. He told me the trial would begin when I stepped through. He told me the environment inside was adaptive. It would reconfigure based on my responses, escalate pressure as I progressed, and that no eternal time signal would be available. He told me the answer token would be recognizable when I reached it, that all subjects reported this clearly, and that I should take whatever time I needed. I thanked him. I stepped through. The space inside was large. That was the first thing. Not vast, not some alien attempt to intimidate with scale, just large the way an industrial maintenance floor is large. Enough room that you couldn't see every corner, from any one position. Enough that the architecture felt functional, rather than theatrical. The walls were the same faintly luminescent material as the door. The floor was smooth. The air was neutral, recycled. The temperature of a room that has been sealed long enough to forget what weather is. In the center of the room there was a structure. It was roughly the size and shape of a freestanding wall panel, the kind you find in pipeline relay stations, access panels, circuit interfaces, junction points arranged in a grid. Except this one was wrong in a dozen small ways. The connectors were types I didn't recognize. The layout followed a logic I couldn't immediately parse. Some of the panels were sealed. Others were open, trailing components that fit together in ways that weren't obvious. I stood in front of it for about 30 seconds. Then I sat down on the floor, 'cause my knees had been complaining since the shuttle. And I started at the top left corner. Here is what I had done for 11 years before I took the audit posting. Deep infrastructure maintenance on subsurface pipeline relay networks in the North Atlantic coastal collapse zone, which means I had spent 11 years in sealed underground environments, alone or nearly alone, diagnosing systems that had been built by people who were dead, modified by people who hadn't documented their modifications, in ways that the original fault reporting software couldn't categorize because the fault was in the fault reporting software. There was no one to ask. There was no manual current enough to be useful. There was the system in front of you, and there was time. And there was the understanding that if you didn't figure it out, people on the surface, whose water, whose heating, whose basic infrastructure ran through the relay you were sitting in front of, would eventually notice. You learn not to look at the whole problem. The whole problem is always too. You look at the piece in front of you. You understand that piece. Then you look at the next piece. The perpetual trial, I came to understand over the following hours, was designed by beings for whom isolation is a graduated, escalating pressure, something that builds and builds until it becomes unbearable. The architecture shifted twice while I was working. Once the lighting changed, cycling toward a dimmer register that I suspected was meant to feel oppressive. Once a low subsonic tone began, below the threshold of hearing but registered in the body as unease. The panel configuration changed once, ranging rough a third of the components I had already mapped. I noted the changes. I remapped the third I needed to remap. The subsonic tone was uncomfortable in the same way that a slightly loose panel cover is uncomfortable. Noticeable, distracting, not a reason to stop. I had worked in louder places. I had worked in darker places. I had worked in places where the smell alone was enough to make a person want to leave, and I had stayed because the work wasn't finished. The answer token was in the final sealed panel. I knew it before I opened the panel because the structure had a logic by then. I had mapped enough of it that the last sealed section was the only part that didn't fit the pattern I'd built. And things that don't fit patterns are either errors or answers. I opened it. The token was a small flat disk, featureless except for a single engraved mark that I didn't recognize but that registered. The proctor administrator had been right about this as unmistakably final. The thing you've been looking for made physical. I put it in my pocket. I stood up. My knees registered their objection. The door back to the corridor appeared in the wall to my left. I walked through it. The proctor administrator was standing exactly where I'd left him. The filaments under his forearms had gone still, which I'd learned by then was not calm. It was the particular stillness of a system that had received an input it hadn't finished processing. He looked at me. He looked at the token I held out to him. He looked at the small screen on the lectern beside him. The screen, I gathered, was showing him the elapsed time. He took the token very carefully, the way you handle something when you're not yet sure it's real. I asked again about my luggage. He said it was in storage bay 4. He said it in the voice of a man answering a question on reflex, because the rest of his mind was occupied. The filaments had started pulsing again. Not the bright, agitated pulse from before, but something slower. Something that looked, in a species I'd known for less than a day, like the physical expression of a long, quiet recalibration. He asked me, after a moment, what the environment had been like. Whether the pressure had been significant. I thought about the subsonic tone. I thought about the shifting panels, changed lighting, the careful architecture of a system designed to feel endless. I told him it had reminded me of work. He wrote something down. He wrote for longer than the answer seemed to warrant. I went to find Bay 4. The Institute's trial documentation, I was told later by a junior administrator, who seemed to find this whole situation professionally thrilling, would need a new entry field. The existing fields were candidate name, species, cohort, start date, completion date, elapsed time, outcome. The elapsed time field was formatted to display in days. It didn't have a setting for hours. They would add one. They would add it after they were done arguing about whether the result was valid, which took 3 days. Longer than the trial itself. The outcome was never seriously in question. You can't argue with a token. What they were arguing about was the field, and the form, and the 218-year-old intake protocol that, still apparently, did not have a combined withdrawal and replacement procedure. Some systems, I have found, are harder to fix than others. The perpetual trial was not one of them.